Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the United States and around the world and give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. I'm pleased today to welcome a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Jon Epstein. We're going to be talking about the issue involving bird flu in the United States, specifically the new news that 2 cats in New York City have been infected with this dangerous virus. And the reason I brought Jon on today is Jon is a real expert in infectious diseases, particularly those that involve animals, the environment, and that spill over into humans. He's worked for many years hunting down viruses and animals and environments on every continent on Earth, and been tracking the evolution of how these viruses eventually get into humans and cause illness and death. So he's my perfect counterpart to be discussing a disease both as interesting and as dangerous as bird flu. Thanks, Jon.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be here. Good to see you.
Great. So before we get started, let me summarize for the viewers a little bit about why we're talking today. So what happened was on March 15th, the New York City Health Department put out a press release. And that press release was titled "Bird Flu Detected in 2 New York City Cats That's Associated with Savage Cat Food, Raw Pet Food." And what the New York City Health Department reported in its press release was that they found out about 2 cats, one who was recently became sick and one who became sick last month, and a third potentially also sick with bird flu, all of whom were in New York City. And it turns out that these cats all have a link that's in common. It all appears that their owners fed them a raw cat food that, as we've been hearing from the news and that we'll talk about a little bit more in here, is one of the many ways in which this disease can get into our pets and potentially also get into us as humans. So one of these cats became ill last month. According to the report, they were hospitalized with a fever, a loss of appetite, and a severe respiratory disease. They were eventually tested at the Special Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at Cornell, which confirmed that they have H5N1, or the bird flu virus. The second cat was diagnosed also with H5N1 last month, and that cat was also in close contact with another cat that also had been sick with what appears to be bird flu, but was never actually confirmed. And again, the common link between all of these 3 cats is that they'd eaten a raw form of cat food. And so that's kind of what's happening right now. And so now, to get into the details of why this matters, that's why I brought Jon on here today to help give us some background. And the first thing, Jon, I wanted you to touch on is, we know that bird flu has been around for a while. It's been circulating everywhere. So give us a little update on how we got from the original discovery or recognition of H5N1 as an illness in animals to now here in New York City, getting into the homes of pet owners and making their cats sick and dying.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think just for a bit of background, it's important to step back and ask the question, where do flu viruses come from? And what's really interesting is all the different flu viruses, whether it's seasonal flu that people get every year or bird flu like H5N1, they all originate ultimately in birds, okay? Migratory waterfowl, things like geese and ducks, animals that move around the world through migration patterns. These are the animals that are the natural reservoir for all types of influenza viruses. And by way of evolution and spread, the viruses become human influenza viruses or pig influenza viruses or other mammalian or other bird influenza viruses. And so there's a big variety of flu viruses circulating in birds around the world. H5N1 is particularly worrisome because it is so highly lethal in chickens and poultry. So that matters in terms of our food security and domestic animal health. But we've also known about this for decades. Bird flu, particularly H5N1, was first discovered in geese back in China in 1996. And it was really the first human case that was discovered a year later in Hong Kong in 1997. That was our first realization that this virus was not only bad for poultry, but could get into people and make them sick. And so when we come now to the issue of cats, and particularly our pet cats, the idea that bird flu, that H5N1 could get into cats isn't surprising, although it is worrying. We've known about this for almost as long as we've known about the virus. Dating back to the 90s, when we had outbreaks in poultry throughout Southeast Asia, we would see cats get infected as well. Cats that were eating poultry carcasses, birds that had died from bird flu, or birds that were sick from bird flu being fed to cats. We've also seen captive big cats get sick and die from H5N1, tigers and lions, and large cats, both in Southeast Asia and in the United States. As recently as last year, big cats in animal sanctuaries had been infected either by eating infected poultry meat or contracting it from wild birds, and they got sick and many of them died as well. So cats have been part of the story ever since the discovery of this virus back in the 90s.
Yeah, John, I think this is, I think something that a lot of people may not know or really be aware of, unless they're people like you and me who are like virus geeks who kind of work all over the world. But, this is the sort of intersection and why, you work and have an organization focused on what's called One Health. And it's really based on this concept that what's spreading among illness among animals, and it doesn't matter if they're wild animals, they're animals that we keep in captivity to raise for food, or animals that we keep in our home, that we're all sharing the same space, right? We're all sharing the same air. We're all coming in contact with the same surfaces. And so it isn't that surprising, unfortunately, that if a disease like this is spreading so rapidly and dramatically across every species in the wild, that eventually it's also going to get into our homes. We just don't know whether it's going to come into our homes because we come into contact with a wild animal, because we come into contact with food, or one of our pets comes into contact with it.
That's right. Contact is a really important piece of this. And although we've seen H5N1 circulating in big poultry outbreaks historically over years, the main thing that's protected us is that historically, this is a virus that is pretty specific to birds. It does rarely get into mammals, but over time, when we've seen this happen, we haven't seen much transmission among mammals. So even though cats that ate poultry got sick and may have died, they weren't readily spreading it to other animals, other mammals, or other cats. That is starting to change. And the way these flu viruses work is they can adapt very quickly when given the opportunity. So one of the things that is worrying, not only about cats that are getting infected by H5N1, is that we've seen massive infections in wild mammals throughout North and South America. In the past year, we've seen marine mammals like seals have massive die-offs and infections. We're seeing rodents and, in North America, foxes and raccoons and mice get infected with this virus. The more times a mammalian species gets infected with this bird flu, the more opportunity there is for the virus to adapt to a mammalian system, and by that virtue, become more of a risk to people.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think one of the first times that I got really worried about influenza, the flu virus in cats, was actually back in December 2016. At that time, I was the deputy commissioner of the New York City Health Department. And we got a report about a bunch of cats that were at a shelter that were all sick with a respiratory virus. And somebody had collected specimens. They'd sent them to a reference laboratory in Wisconsin, a well-known virology laboratory, and found a different strain of animal influenza, but an avian influenza strain nonetheless. And that got me incredibly worried. And we did this massive investigation that was eventually published, where we found that thankfully only one person who had been working with those cats had actually gotten sick. But this to me was,
that was a veterinarian, wasn't it?
Yeah. And this was actually somebody that was sampling the cats to try to figure out why they got sick. Mm-hmm. So it was just an example, a striking example to me about how I was worried that even here in New York City, an urban environment where we don't think about like animal viruses emerging, right? We think about human infections, or maybe you get worried about, oh, a rat's going to make me sick. But to think about our domestic pets being sick, that was the first time it was really striking and worrisome to me. And we had to mobilize a really big response at the health department at that time, because I was so worried that this could spread so easily through the city. And again, thankfully, that was a strain that wasn't particularly infectious. What is it? So let's get into cats here in New York City a little bit. What is it about cats that makes them so susceptible to influenza and other respiratory viruses? I think one of the things that's interesting maybe for viewers to note is that we had a problem like this during COVID, right? Like cats are very susceptible to coronaviruses, just like they're susceptible to influenza viruses. So why don't you tell me a little bit about, how cats and humans, how we all get sick with kind of similar viruses?
Well, so cats and humans are different physiologically, but cats are susceptible to respiratory viruses like people are. And we saw that with COVID. It's a great point you bring up. And cats also can get other types of influenza viruses. There aren't a lot of diseases that transmit from cats to people, but we do tend to share the same environments. We often eat similar foods. We breathe the same air. We live in the same buildings or households. So there's a lot of opportunity, given the right virus that has the ability to affect or infect animals and people, that if it's going to get into people, it might get into our pets and vice versa. And now we're in a really precarious position in the United States. We used to talk about bird flu as being something that originated in Southeast Asia and kind of stayed in other parts of the world. But we have a very serious epidemic of H5N1 on our poultry farms in the United States and our cattle farms. And this is new. Seeing H5N1 infecting dairy cows, and as pervasively as it is, it's on about 40 different dairy cattle farms throughout the United States, means there is a lot of opportunity not only for this virus to adapt to mammals by infecting cows, but also workers who go into these dairy farms and milk the cows. They get exposed to raw milk. They're in close contact with the animals. They have been getting exposed to this virus, and there are cases of humans getting H5N1. There are also cases of cats that live on these farms getting H5N1. And what we've seen most recently is that there have been cases where people have come home from working on dairy farms infected with H5N1, and their cats, which have no exposure directly to poultry or cows, have gotten infected. So there is real suspicion of transmission from people to their cats.
Yeah, and I think CDC also just had a report that came out in February in MMWR. It was unfortunately one of these reports that got held up during the period when the new administration was blocking communications from CDC. The way they did a survey in what we call a serologic survey, right? Where you take blood specimens to look at who might have been infected in the past. And it found that there was at least one veterinarian that looked like they had been infected with H5N1, even though they work with small mammals, small animals like cats, and had no history of exposure. So there is no doubt, I think, from any of us, from you, from me, from anybody else who studies this, that we're missing, and that despite all the infections that you've described and documented, we're missing a lot. There's so many different opportunities for different types of animals to get infected, and humans, as you just mentioned, whether it's humans working on farms, whether it's humans contacting the food, whether it's humans working with animals in a veterinary clinic or some other setting, or now, as we described, this intermediary, your pet, wandering around outside or eating a food that's contaminated and then bringing it back in the home.
And this does come down to a really important point, and that is food. Let's say you have no exposure at all. I've never gone to a dairy farm. I don't plan to. I don't know anybody who works on a dairy farm or a poultry farm. How am I going to ever get exposed to H5N1? And it becomes an issue of food. There's two sources now that are of particular risk. For cats, what we're talking about today is raw diets. These are raw cat food diets made with unprocessed, uncooked poultry meat that could come from infected birds. In fact, that's how we suspect that these raw diets led to the infections in New York City. And on the human side, it's raw milk. We do know that consuming raw, unpasteurized milk could be a risk factor for contracting this virus if it comes from an infected cow. So there's two access points to people and cats that come directly through diets and don't require any direct exposure to cows or poultry.
Yeah. So, and this has been a real struggle. I started my CDC career working in foodborne diseases, and we used to work all the time on these outbreaks that were associated with raw milk, with people tasting raw meat and, roast beef and other things like that, which they hadn't cooked well enough. And it's really a problem, right? In 2025, we're still trying to teach people that, in fact, despite what evolutionary history you want to grab onto, you say, well, people or animals in the past always ate raw food. We live in a society right now that is so closely interconnected with everything else, that eating these types of diets doesn't just make you sick. It threatens the health of other people. And now we're seeing an example of it doesn't just make your animal sick. It's going to make your animal sick, and then it could make other humans sick on top of that as well.
That's right. It's ironic, too, because going back in history, when we used to spend a lot of time with farm animals, sometimes that actually helped us develop resistance to infectious disease. We would get exposed to diseases animals had at a low level, and it conferred some kind of immunity. But now we're often divorced from any contact with live animals. And being in that kind of virtual bubble means we're even more sensitive or susceptible to viruses or other pathogens, bacteria that maybe have grown up in animals, but have the opportunity to spread into people who are generally naive to them. That means we're generally susceptible to getting infected.
Yeah. Okay. So since I want to, bring this back down to the issue of people who own cats, whether you live in New York City or any other setting as well, too. A couple of things. First of all, how the way these illnesses got detected is a bit of a concern to me, because it's another example of the delay that we have in diagnosing any infectious disease, whether it's in a human or somebody else.
Yeah.
We're getting a report right now in the middle of March of a cat that was infected sometime in February. It sounds like there was one that was infected recently, but one a while back. And so let's go through this a little bit. If you're a pet owner, how are you going to know whether your cat has the flu or not?
Yeah. I think the first thing is to mention that right now, cat infections with H5N1 are rare. So it shouldn't be the first thing you think of. But let's talk about some of the signs you might see in your pet cat who is sick. It might be that your cat is more lethargic than usual, less active than usual. They might have fever. They might lose their appetite, seem a little bit disoriented or uninterested in the general normal interactions they'd have with you. And in some cases, H5N1 can cause neurologic signs in cats. So they might even seem off balance, uncoordinated. If you see these signs at all in your cat, it may be an indication they're sick with something. And again, it might be worth taking them to your veterinarian who can collect samples and rule out or test for H5N1. But if you're not feeding your cat a raw diet, there's very little chance at this point they're going to be exposed to H5N1. And it wouldn't be the first thing that would jump to your mind.
But it is possible, right, for a human to infect their cat, right? So if, for example, one of our viewers right now is a veterinarian or, comes into contact with wild animals in some way, even if they're wandering through the parks, for example, sometimes, I think it's also important to keep in mind that if you or someone in your household had an illness that could be this type of flu, and keep in mind that H5N1 is presenting in humans with a little bit of variance. So you're getting a lot of people with red eyes, with conjunctivitis as an infection. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing to watch out for, is not just the cat's illnesses, but other illnesses in the household and the human.
It's a great point. And again, it brings us back to COVID, when we were all really astute and paying attention to our own illness and situation. Our recommendations then was that if you had COVID and you knew you had COVID or suspected it, keep some distance from your cat because they were susceptible to infection too. And the same could be said now. If you have flu-like symptoms, if you feel like you might be sick with a respiratory illness, it's a good precaution to keep some distance from your cat. Maybe have a different family member handle them, take care of them, that sort of thing until you feel better. And of course, if you're tested and diagnosed with H5N1, then pay attention to your cat. And if they show any signs of illness, get them into a veterinarian as well.
Yeah. Are there any drugs that are available to treat cats? Do we have also?
No, there's really no treatment at this point, and there's no vaccination for H5N1 that's available for pets. So the best thing we can do right now is pay careful attention, be astute, seek medical attention for your pet if you feel that they're sick. But other than that, prevention is the best preventative.
Yeah, exactly. And the other point that I would make to people is that, and I think this is a real challenge, is make sure your veterinarian knows that you know about bird flu infections in cats, because it is possible. And I can tell you this as a human health provider, or as somebody who's owned pets many times in my life, that sometimes you need to be the one to, to push on it, but you could say, hey, I just also want to double check. Because the thing is, these are not tests that can be done at your routine laboratory. The same way doing your regular testing, if your cat has diabetes or something else like that, you're going to have to get them to do a specialized test. And so it's important to know whether that's necessary. And of course, we also have to deal with the question of cost, right? Human health is expensive as well, but veterinary health, most people don't.
It sure is. And most likely your veterinarian will want to rule out more common things before they jump to the conclusion of an H5N1 diagnosis or even testing. So they'll look for other common respiratory infections in cats. Some cats can present with respiratory symptoms from allergies. It could be, there are feline respiratory viruses that are common, especially if your cat's an outdoor cat and it might be exposed to other animals throughout the course of the day, or you're bringing your cats to shelters where it's boarding with other cats and other animals while you're on vacation. Those are times when cats can be susceptible to picking up respiratory infections. And so we'll just want to be aware of that in those circumstances.
Okay, that's great. So before we close up here, I want to run through a couple of recommendations for viewers out there, whether you come from a health background or whether you're just someone that's interested in these issues. For people who own pets, really, really important. Stay away from raw milk and raw food, both in yourself and in your pets. We understand that you may have reasons why you believe that these are potentially healthier. And it certainly may be that in a world where they're free of infections, there may be situations in which they provide some health benefits. But for now, especially now, it's really important to keep your animals as healthy and you as healthy as possible by avoiding those. We'd also recommend that if you have an indoor cat, keep them indoors.
Yes.
Any cats that you have that are going outdoors, they're at risk, right? They can come into contact with any types of animals that leave droppings, or the birds that, come land on your porch or something. And if your cats are sick, make sure you get them to a veterinarian to follow up on these things as much as possible. And then the last thing I would say here is about also consider these illnesses in yourself. That if you are actually sick yourself, keep an eye on your pets. Try to keep yourself away from them as best as you can. John, anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think that's great advice. And we're going to have to pay careful attention to the situation. There's already monitoring going on dairy farms and trying to understand the situation as people are getting infected. But we all have to be vigilant and pay attention because we may find surprising routes of infection. And so I think the advice you're giving is spot on, Jay.
Okay, great. Well, John, it was great to have you here. And for any of the viewers out there, I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to keep coming back to this issue about H5N1, and John and I are going to be around to give you updates on news that's going to keep you and hopefully your pets in your home as healthy as possible.